ChatGPT is actually surprisingly good at outlines, and in this video we're going to take that to the beginner stage that most authors start with, which is creating a series outline, and see how that works for us. Let's get into it. Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel, and today we're going to be constructing a series outline. We're going to be looking at a couple of different series lengths, but hopefully with the ideas you'll get in this video, you'll be able to adapt those series lengths to whatever your series should be. And that's just something that you're going to have to get a feel for your specific series, but we're going to be looking at a couple of different options. Now, one thing to note about series is that a good series will have structure. It won't just be one book after another, after another, after another, never ending. And at the same time, it won't, it has an overall arc. And we talk a lot in writing workshops and things like that about having your character arc and your plot arc in a single book. And one of the difficulties that newer authors will deal with, at least I certainly did, was giving the character another character arc in the next book and then another one in the next book, and then thinking like, well, I'm correcting all these flaws in this person. By the end of the series, they're just going to be superhuman, essentially. They're going to have no flaws left. And so part of the challenge of a series is trying to come up with ways to make that character learn and grow in each book, but also have an overarching structure. And so it's because of that that I actually recommend that you pick one of the standard story structures that are out there, and there are tons of them, and we'll look at two today, and then use that as the basic framework for your series. And using AI will actually make this a whole lot easier for you. And so let's dive in a little bit. So we're going to start with a trilogy, a classic trilogy. It's very common in a variety of different mediums and genres. But the trilogy works because it is actually following the 3-act format, usually. And a really good example of this is the original Star Wars trilogy. I think Star Wars gets referred to more than anything when it comes to story structure because it actually got that part down pat. Like it is so good at this. The first Star Wars movie was not only a tight, well-contained plot of its own that followed the hero's journey and followed the 3-act structure, but then you look at the entire trilogy, so that's A New Hope, Empire Strikes Back, and Return of the Jedi, and all three of those together also follow a 3-act story that's a little bit more broad, and also follow the hero's journey. And so it's a wonderful lesson in how to create a really well-structured trilogy. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a trilogy based on the 3-act structure. And here's the prompt that we're going to be using. I'm just going to copy this into here. Using the standard 3-act structure, create a 3-book series outline about the initial concept below. We'll get to that. Each book mapped to the 3 acts of the perspective from the perspective of the protagonist, because we want to make sure we're figuring out the main plot line with the main character. Even though each book is only one part of the 3-act structure, each one should also be a complete story. With that in mind, make sure each book also follows the 3-act structure and list each act for all 3 books. The reason I add this last part in there is because I found that when you try to give it a story concept and say, write a 3-book series modeled after the 3-act structure, it will actually create just one book, essentially. And the first part where it's talking about the first act will actually be more like the first act of a single book. And so we want to make sure each book also has its own 3-act structure, a beginning, middle, and an end. And that helps the AI understand that each book should be a standalone, more or less, work that has a beginning, middle, and an end. And then each one also progresses this larger plot. So after that, we need to give it some story details. So I usually add something like this: initial story concept with a colon, and then start adding in these details. I've already put this together, so I'm not going to type it out right now. But here it is. This is an urban fantasy series that involves Michael, a woman who, in the first book, discovers she has certain abilities that make her uniquely able to find and destroy mythical monsters. Each book should primarily deal with a different beast from various world mythologies, and each one should be appropriate for her character arc. At the end of book one, at the end of book one, she needs to die, and in book two, she struggles in hell, and by the beginning of book three, is leading a revolution in hell. She is fully resurrected at the end of book three. This is a story concept I'm actually going to be working on, although I probably won't do it in 3 books. I've adapted it for 3 books here, but this is a story concept I'm working on. Now, it's important to put whatever information you already know down here into this prompt so it has an idea of where to go. If you just ask it to create a basic outline, it will give you something very generic. But the more you can give it, the better it'll be. And if I really wanted to, I could flesh this out even further, give it more details about the character, their character arc. I could add in some information about some of the side characters. You might not know all of this, and so you might have to do some of the other tasks to build out the characters, to build out the synopsis, things that I've talked about in past videos, so that you can then take that information and put it in here. I figured this was sufficient enough to demonstrate what this is going to be about. But ideally, for instance, I have the bit about how each book needs to deal with a different mythical monster. I might already want a list of what those monsters should be, and that's something I would figure out in a brainstorming session with ChatGPT. But there you go. So that's where we're starting with, and we'll see if this gives us a decent 3-act structure broken into 3 books. All right, so we have finally got this outline, and it did a pretty decent job. So first we have book 1, Michael's Awakening, which it's labeling as the setup, and act 1, which is what we want. We want the first book to basically act as act 1 of the entire series. And it has successfully broken this down into 3 acts. We have the introduction and revelation. So Michael is living a normal life in the city until she starts experiencing inexplicable events. She meets Gabriel, a seasoned monster hunter, finds out she's a hunter. A little generic, a little supernatural, but I'll allow it. And then we get the Nemean lion, so it's figured out one of those mythological beasts. And that seems to be the subject of the first book. And like I asked it to, she slays the Nemean lion, but dies in the process. And so moving on to book 2, Michael's Trials, which is a good name for something that's act 2 of something. The confrontation in act 2. This one also has 3 acts. Michael finds herself in hell, stripped of her hunter abilities. Here she encounters the mythical Cerberus. Initially, she feels despair and isolation and struggles with her loss of power. This is pretty good. In my version, it'll be a little different. Not planning on having Cerberus in there, but who knows? So that's a case where I would want to give it more details so it could use that. And then book 3, also in a 3-act structure, but acting as the 3rd act of the entire book series. So that is a standard trilogy. And honestly, if I were to follow this outline exactly, this wouldn't be too bad. It's not quite what I want for the series that I've been dreaming of for a couple of years now, but this you could work with this and it wouldn't be too bad. And so if I were to do this for myself, I would just work with it a little bit more to get the specifics of what I want, but I might just start with this and just write it all myself anyway. So that is a trilogy. We're going to open up a new window here for GPT-4, and then we're going to do this again, but this time with a different story structure. And the story structure we're going to be using is the hero's journey. The nice thing about the hero's journey is that it is broken up into, well, at least the version popularized by Christopher Vogler is broken up into 12 parts, which means if you want to do a very long series, the hero's journey can actually be a really good model for your books that for a long series for those purposes. And so we're going to use this prompt, and the prompt is very similar. All right, I'm just going to copy the whole thing into here. Using the hero's journey as defined by Christopher Vogler, create a 12-book series outline about the initial concept below, each book mapped to the 12 stages of the hero's journey from the perspective of the protagonist. Even though each book is only one part of the hero's journey, each one should also be a complete story. With that in mind, make sure each book follows the 3-act structure and list each act for all 12 books. So that might sound familiar. It's very similar to the 3-act structure one that we just did, except modified to encompass a 12-book series that is focused on the hero's journey. Now, I should point out, I'm able to use the 3-act structure and the 12-stage hero's journey because ChatGPT knows what it is, and it knows really well. If I were to use, say, the 24-chapter novel outline, which I've used in past videos, I would need to input that information myself. Or you might have your own structure that you particularly like for a series. You like, book 1 to do this, book 2 to do this, and so forth. And so you would need to add that in there. And if I were doing that, I would come here under this first paragraph and add, like, here is my series framework. Then I'd start with number 1, and then I'd say book 1, colon, and then whatever information you want to give it about book 1 in a series and the role that it plays. And then you could do that. But we're not going to do that because it already understands the hero's journey really well. But if you are using a structure, which you should use a structure that ChatGPT does not know very well, then maybe you might want to consider inputting that into the prompt as well. So the initial story concept is pretty much the same except expanded for 12 books. This is an urban fantasy series that involves Michael, a woman who in the first book discovers she has certain abilities that make her uniquely able to find and destroy mythical monsters. Each book should primarily deal with a different beast from various world mythologies, and each one should be appropriate for her character arc as defined by the 12 steps of the hero's journey. At the end of book 6, she needs to die, and in books 7 through 8, she struggles in hell, and by book 9 is leading a revolution in hell. She's fully resurrected at the end of book 10 or the beginning of book 11. Let's see what it gives us. And we now have a pretty solid series outline for this series. And I actually was reading this as it was generating, and I got kind of excited because some of the ideas really sound kind of cool. So we have book 1, The Siren's Echo, which represents stage 1 of the hero's journey, the ordinary world. Michael lives in a mundane life in Chicago, working as a barista and daydreaming about escaping her humdrum existence. One night she starts hearing strange melodic sounds no one else seems to hear, and follows them to a vicious siren causing havoc. She unexpectedly wields power that neutralizes the siren. Act 3, Refusal of the Call. Shaken by the events, Michael retreats back into her normal life, denying her newfound abilities. I did notice that it's kind of layering the different steps of the hero's journey. We have each book is following the hero's journey to a certain extent, but it looks like it also made each act also following the hero's journey, which we don't want. So I might regenerate this. But so far I'm okay with it. Let's just keep reading. Book 2, Gorgon's Veil. When the serpentine Gorgon starts turning people into stone, Michael realizes she must confront her destiny. She's assisted by an enigmatic mentor, a retired monster hunter named Leo, who helps her harness her abilities. Accepting her destiny, Michael vows to save her city, battling and defeating the Gorgon. So let's move ahead to like where I started to give it some information. So I told it that at the end of book 6 that she needed to die. So Michael dies in the arms of her allies, symbolizing the end of her journey in the mortal realm. That's correct. Michael wakes up in an underworld and struggles to understand her new reality. She battles demonic creatures while delving deeper into the underworld, ultimately getting captured by Hades himself. Michael ends up in Hades' chains, a prisoner in the underworld, and so on and so on. And this is all matching the hero's journey pretty well, actually. I particularly liked it once I got to this point. Michael starts building a fair rule in the underworld, but yearns for her previous life. A chance for resurrection presents itself, but it's perilous and involves leaving her kingdom. She chooses her city over the underworld, embarking on a journey of resurrection. She's resurrected, but her city's under attack from a colossal titan. And then the last one was actually she fights against the Olympians. So it got really epic here at the end. And again, that's not exactly where I would go with it, but this is a great place to start for me if I wanted to create that series outline. And when you're creating a series outline, you don't necessarily need to know too much yet. You can just have the bare details of what happens in each book. And then we would take each book and then further flesh it out to get more information about what happens in that book. And let's just give an example of what that would look like. So let's say we don't have any modifications to this first book. We'll just say, take the first book and flesh it out further into a full synopsis following the 3-act structure. Add additional information about the character Michael. Add a mentor figure called who is actually the mythical god Osiris, who mysteriously appears now and then. This is just some of the details I have in my head. Add a side character who is a friend of Michael. Give and add a subplot to the story and track it across all 3 acts. And I think that's good. We can stick with that and then see what it gives us for book 1. And we now have this more detailed version of book 1, which is really awesome. Actually, I quite enjoyed reading it. Again, it's not quite exactly where I would go with this, but you absolutely could go with this and it would be a coherent, interesting story. One of the things that it did is it added this subplot about her friend Luke. Luke has been struggling with his music, feeling like he's lost his creative spark. And so that's the subplot for Act 1. In Act 2, it continues, inspired by these extraordinary events, Luke finds new inspiration for his music, translating these events into songs while helping Michael navigate this new reality. And then at the end, throughout the ordeal, Luke helps Michael and provides moral support, all the while creating an entire album inspired by her experiences, which is just the perfect amount of levity that I think could actually make a decent subplot. It doesn't have much to do with the plot of the story. And so it would need to be a very subtle, not too important subplot, just a little thing on the side to kind of add some humor and things. But it did a pretty good job. It added every one of the details that I asked it to. And now we have, I'd say, a decent synopsis here that we could then take and start expanding into chapters and so forth. And go and watch my first video about writing with ChatGPT. It's the first one I ever did. And you'll see the process I do from taking a concept to a synopsis and a synopsis to a more fleshed out outline, and then from that to story beats, and from that to finished prose. So this is a good place to start. I hope this has been useful for you. And if you do need to use a series structure that is different than the hero's journey or the 3-act structure, say you only want 5 books, you can figure out a structure that models itself near one of these main story structures that are out there and find a way to do it in 5 chapters. As a general rule of thumb, the first act and the third act tend to be shorter. So for instance, a good example of what this might work is if I wanted to do a 4-book series, I would maybe take the 3-act structure and split Act 2 into 2 books. Because the first book could be Act 1 and the 4th book could be Act 3. But those tend to be shorter acts anyway, so you could have 2 and 3 as the second act respectively. So that's just one example of a way you could flesh this out to work for more than 3 or more than or different than 3 or 12 books. But it really depends on the structure you give it. That's the most important thing, is that you develop some kind of structure before you ask it to give you a series outline. Hope this was useful, and I'll see you in the next video.